Hello and welcome to Press TV's debate. I'm Marzia Hashemi. Thanks so much for being with us. The cost of remaining on the throne seems to be getting higher. This time, the Bahraini regime has just executed 3 more activists due to their dissent to the regime. Manama says the men killed 3 police. Bahrainis say the men, ranging in age from 21 to 42, were tortured into confessing. Now, the UN and some international human rights organizations have condemned the execution, saying the men were tortured and made to confess under duress and executed for simply protesting against the repressive regime. Are the days of the Al Khalifa regime numbered as its brutality increases? Stay with us as we take a look at the deteriorating situation in Bahrain.
Angry Bahraini citizens take to the streets in protest against the execution of 3 activists over alleged involvement in a bombing in 2014. The rallies took place in towns and villages across Bahrain, with protesters calling for the prosecution of the Al Khalifa regime for its, quote, crimes.
Today, the fact that they, again, feel entitled and emboldened enough by the likes of the US and the UK to kill those 3 youth, and we need to remember that when they were arrested and tortured, they were actually underage. And this is the kind of regime, those are the allies that the UK and the US continue to stand by and actually prop up and support and actually even defend on the international scene. So this is beyond despicable to have democracy stand by the likes of Al Khalifa. Al Khalifa has lost all legitimacy.
Bahraini clerics have released a statement in condemnation of the execution of Abbas al-Sami, Sami Mushaima and Ali al-Sakis. The clerics have also called for the continuation of nationwide anti-government rallies. Opposition groups say the 3 men were forced to confess under torture to carrying out the bombing that killed 3 police officers.
This is not an act of justice, this is an act of murder and repression and genocide. What they have been doing in Bahrain since 2011 is trying to not just redact a people's right to political self-determination by annihilating as many people as they can and trying to portray this as some kind of a sectarian movement and trying to portray this as some kind of a takeover, an illegitimate takeover against the rightful owner of Bahrain, which is Al Khalifa.
The execution of the 3 Bahraini nationals has drawn condemnation from the United Nations and Amnesty International.
The fact that this execution was carried out after an unfair trial and despite claims from the men that they were tortured in custody makes this news even more shocking.
Iran has also strongly condemned the executions. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman Bahram Qasemi says Bahrain is moving towards a political suffocation by harshly cracking down on dissent. The popular uprising in Bahrain began in 2011 after similar movements engulfed several other Arab countries ruled by authoritarian regimes including Tunisia, Libya and Egypt. The Manama government harshly cracks down on protesters. A large number of people have lost their lives. Thousands have been arrested during the period, with many of them sentenced to long jail terms. Western governments have largely remained silent on the human rights situation. Bahrain is a close ally of the US and Britain. The Persian Gulf Kingdom buys weapons from both Washington and London.
I'd like to welcome my guest to the program out of Washington, D.C., former U.S. diplomat to Saudi Arabia, Mr. Michael Springman, and out of San Francisco, California, investigative journalist, Mr. Lee Kaplan. Thank you both for being with us. Let's start this off in San Francisco. And Lee Kaplan, why do you think the regime has chosen this time, after 6 years of not executing anyone, to inflict the death penalty via firing squad?
Well, you know, the United States right now is going through a change of presidential administrations, and I think the incoming Trump administration is probably more inclined to be strict regarding punishment for people involved in terrorism. This is only a guess. Of course, I can't speak for the U.S. State Department, but my guess would be that's one reason why the Bahrainis probably feel more secure in carrying out the death sentence that they have for these people. By the way, your news report said that they were activists. They weren't just activists, they were terrorists, and they killed 3 police officers, as it was said. And it also said it was an unfair trial, but My understanding is that they found a fingerprint as evidence on the bomb materials of at least one of the terrorists involved. So it's a question of, if you believe in the death penalty or don't believe in the death penalty, that's another discussion for another day.
Okay, well, let me bring Mr. Springman in on it. Stay with me, Mr. Kaplan. Mr. Springman, your take, because we have people that said that they were tortured and that they did confess, but it was totally under duress. Go ahead, sir. Your take on all this.
Well, I would tend to support that notion. The government of Bahrain is essentially a long-term repressive and repulsive government that does not like the slightest bit of opposition. And this situation is nothing new. It goes back decades. In the 1990s, the people of Bahrain were demonstrating for a constitutional monarchy and to bring back their 1973 constitution with the provision for a parliamentary government. And the present king, when he took over from his father, the emir, about 1999, he had promised to have a parliamentary government and a constitutional monarchy. And lo and behold, he turned around and said absolutely not, gave himself unlimited powers almost. And when anyone challenged this, beginning in 2011, he clamped down on them, jailing them, shooting them, torturing them. And this has continued to the present day. This is 2017. And I would hope that the days of this government is numbered. But unfortunately, when people protest, they get nowhere with this man and his government. He has been bringing in Sunnis from all over the Arab world and Pakistan to dilute the Shia majority, which is 70%. But it isn't a Shia-Sunni issue, as some people like to claim, especially in the United States. The situation is that everyone of all religions, whether they are Muslim, whether they are atheist, or whether they are Christian who are living in Bahrain, are opposed to what's going on there. They've been demonstrating since 2011. When they first did this, the government invited the Saudis and the Emiratis to invade the country and put down the uprisings. And every time it pops up again, just as it has just now, they clamp down again and try to be as brutal and repressive as they possibly can.
Okay.
And they're supported by the United States.
Okay, stay with me, Mr. Spring. What about that, Mr. Kaplan? The role, actually, as Mrs. Spring was just talking about, the role of the United States, the role of the UK in actually supporting this repressive regime. And, of course, Saudi Arabia definitely is also involved in that. And actually, as Mrs. Springman has alluded to, actually the Saudis and the Emiratis were the one that sent in some of the first repressive troops that clamped down on these people, majority of the population, who was just asking for their rights.
Well, in that part of the world, all of the Islamic countries are repressive regimes. And you say the United States supports them. I don't know so much that the United States supports them as much as the United States diplomatically tries to get along with them. Now, I know that Iran is on the opposite side of the fence on this. And Iran, of course, to the Bahrainis, poses a threat of the country being taken over by the Velati Faqih regime. So I'm not sympathizing with either side on this, and I think that's the State Department's position on it also.
And Mr. Springman, I want to look at the UK's role in all of this. What exactly does it mean when just last month UK Prime Minister Theresa May was in Bahrain? Do you think she possibly warned them about human rights abuses? Although it doesn't seem likely, being that this month they've already killed and executed these 3 young men. Your take on the role of London?
Well, the British are the same kind of people as the Americans and as the Israelis, which is not exactly a democratic state. It's an apartheid repressive state. But in the case of Britain, Amnesty International has roundly condemned them for such fatuous statements as that we are praising Bahrain's record on human rights. We think they're improving greatly, and we support them. And this is absolute nonsense.
Well, what about that, Mr. Kaplan?
That if you're...
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Mrs. Springman. Go ahead.
Okay, well, if you're a Bahraini, you are actually a second-class citizen in comparison to some of the people who are brought in to try and dilute the Shia majority. If you're a Sunni Bahraini and you're born there, or if you're a Shia, you're stuck because you have to wait 20 years for government-supplied housing, whereas if you're one of these imports designed to dilute the Shia 70% majority, you get catered to, you get what you want right away. And it's absolutely disgusting. And the American government, with its Fifth Fleet headquartered in Manama, I think only makes matters worse. They know that Big Brother will come to their rescue if the people of Bahrain want a free democratic government and limits on this despot that's controlling the government at the present time.
What about that, Mr. Kaplan? Why don't we see more action by the United States, as Mrs. Springman has just said, about the Fifth Fleet being there? Of course, it doesn't take much for Washington to put pressure on a country, a small country like Bahrain, as far as watching what they do and assuring the people's human rights. So why don't we see that type of pressure by Washington on the regime?
Oh, first off, before I comment on that, let me correct my opponent. Israel is not an apartheid state. Non-Jews, Muslims, Arabs have the same civil rights as Jews do in that country by law. So let's clarify that. Now, what you're talking about is there's obviously a conflict between Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims. And, of course, Iran is a Shia country, and Iran would love to see Bahrain taken over. The U.S. has a naval base in Bahrain also, which has interests there. So the United States has to tread carefully a little bit with its relationships with Bahrain, even though it may not like a lack of civil rights in that country. But it's kind of funny to hear Iran talk about a lack of civil rights or an abuse of human rights when the Iranians are more guilty of violating those things than the Bahrainis. Not excusing anything that's happening today, but this is the pot calling the kettle black.
Well, it would be interesting.
So,
I'm sure, Mr. Kaplan,
based
on what you're saying, it would be quite interesting to see what the mainstream media actually would be doing if Iran today had shot and killed 3 people by firing squad. I can only imagine what the mainstream media would be doing right now. But, Mr. Springman, it has been revealed that the British commandos actually have even been involved in training Bahraini security forces as recently as last month in small arms handling and sniping tactics. Exactly what does this mean that the UK is that tightly involved in such a repressive regime that has been shown time and time again to totally be ignoring the rights of its citizens?
Well, that's the British for you. In the past, they controlled most of the Persian Gulf region. All of the current so-called countries there now, like the Emirates and Qatar and the rest of them, they were the trucial states whose affairs were administered by the British government. The colonial masters may have changed and tried to make a disappearing act, but in actual fact, they're still there, they're still helping. And every time anybody questions any of this, every time somebody in Bahrain says, we want a real government, the Khalifa there, he says, oh, well, you know, it was Nasserite socialists that were doing all these bad things, or then it was the communists, and now it's the Iranians who are terrorists and all kinds of horrible creatures. It's absolutely outrageous. The United States has tremendous influence there. There are 6,000 American sailors, soldiers, civilian contractors, and their dependents in Bahrain. And that is the home port for the Fifth Fleet, with a Nimitz-class aircraft carrier with a crew of 6,000 men. Plus, you've got submarines, cruisers, destroyers, support ships, and assault ships for beach landings. And these add, I don't know how many thousand more sailors and Marines to the region. I mean, all the Americans have to say to the Bahraini government is, you either change your ways or we're pulling out and we'll make a home port someplace else. And in fact, if we have any sense, we'll pull out of the Persian Gulf entirely.
Go ahead, Mr. Kaplan. You're laughing. You want to comment?
it's absurd. It's absurd the way he talks. First of all, it's a known fact that the regime in Iran is the greatest state supporter of international terrorism.
Mr.
So let's not talk
are we
about
going
it like,
to stay on the subject? Are we going to stay on the subject, sir? Because otherwise it's going to get in a battle and talking about Israel and Zionists and then you with Iran. Stay on subject, sir. What about you want to comment? You want to comment on what Mr. Springman has said?
That's right. I'm commenting on what Mr. Freeman has said. And when he talks about the U.S. forces in Bahrain, that is to check Iran's expansion in the region. And Iran would love to take over Bahrain, whether it's through supporting a Shia population there against the present regime. And again, you know, I'm a believer in democracy and freedom and all that stuff.
But certain places,
I'm not crazy about the fact.
But is it certain places? Is that belief in democracy and freedom and all that stuff, as you said? It's just a certain people are privy to that. When the Bahraini people, who are more than 70% of the population, are demanding their freedom, demanding democracy, demanding the right to choose their government, what's the difference between those people and people elsewhere in the UK, in the US? Why can't they have their right?
I would question your figure, 70% of the population, number one. And number two, again, we're talking about international world politics and we're talking about international security. And when he makes a statement, when my opponent makes a statement that the United States could just snap their fingers and say to the Bahrainis, do this or else, and why don't the United States pull their troops out of there? Well, I'm sure Iran would love that, but of course it's not going to happen. So you're not answering
the question, do these people have the right to democracy? Do they have the right to choose their own government? That is the question, sir. Why wouldn't they have the right to democracy?
Well, yes, they have a right to democracy, that's true. However, it's the old story of they can choose their own form of government and then they throw away democracy. This happened in Egypt, by the way. They had Morsi in control there, and they brought the Muslim Brotherhood in to control the company. So it was a democratic vote.
Okay, Mr. Kaplan.
Just one time.
We're getting on all types of subjects.
Just a minute.
What does Bahrain, sir? What does Bahrain, sir, have to do with Egypt? Why are you trying to link all Muslim countries that they are the same? What does Bahrain have to do with Egypt, sir?
It's the same. It's the same situation in that region of the world, okay? In Egypt, they used democratic principles, so they got in the Muslim Brotherhood, and it was one vote, one time to put in a dictatorial government. So what you've got is you're asking for the same type of situation. And you're asking me why would the United States...
Since you're using Egypt, so what we had a dictator. We had Mubarak, of course, supported by the West for many years. And you are right, actually, in this region. That is perhaps the biggest problem. Mr. Springman, would you agree that because of the United States and because of the UK's support for dictatorships, or in this case, a so-called royal family that has been imposed on the actual people of the country, that this is actually the biggest problem, and that is this outside interference in the affairs of the people of the region?
Yes, I would agree with exactly what you said. It's not the Iranians that are bombing Yemen, it's the Saudis. Iran didn't invade Bahrain when people were demonstrating on behalf of more freedom and more democracy. It was the Saudis who did this. So I think the United States ties itself to these repressive and repulsive governments because they know that they can keep a lid on much more easily than a democratically elected constitutional government. And because of this, because of these people, the Americans can do deals with one or two corrupt individuals to get the advantage of bases and positions to gain control of the region. And that's the main issue. The United States supports not democracy, not freedom, not constitutional government, but repressive and repulsive dictatorships.
And Mr. Kaplan, do you think that this is a sheer sign of desperation, though, of this Bahraini regime, that despite the outcry inside of the country and outside of the country, that they basically assassinated or killed these 3 people without many saying actually being able to have fair representation and a fair court?
You know, you're using words to twist things. You say assassination. This wasn't an assassination. These were 3 terrorists who murdered 3 policemen in Bahrain. Now, if you want to say, is the Bahrain government a dictatorship? Yes, it is. Is that right? No, I don't think it's right. However, in international affairs, sometimes you just have to pick and choose your battles and your allies in order to have control. And you see, you jump on me and you try. Wait, let me finish talking, Merzia.
Go ahead. 30 seconds.
The fact is that the Iranian government, the Shia government of Iran, would love to take over Bahrain and expand its control over that region of the world. And the United States right now has a military base there. They can't force the Bahrainis to do what they don't want to do. And it's fine to talk about democracy, but I said it's the same. The allusion to Egypt was just the situation that you're talking about, and they got Morsi in there.
All right.
And ultimately, the Egyptians got rid of him.
I'm sorry, I gave you 30 seconds. Actually, I gave you more, but we're just about out of time. Mrs. Springman, 30 seconds in closing, sir. Your take on all of this. Are we seeing the beginning of the end? Because we're seeing so much, it seems like desperation on the part of the regime. Your take, sir.
Well, I would like to say it's the beginning of the end, or even the end of the beginning, but I am afraid that with Bahrain being backed by the British government and by the American government, this may be a small hiccup in its long road of repression. I don't see any change coming in Bahrain unless the government is overthrown, unless the people manage to gain control in spite of a government monopoly on weapons. I think that it's really not going to change, and that the government, if anything, may become worse and far more repressive if it sees its hold on power threatened in any reasonable way.
All right, and unfortunately, we're out of time. I appreciate both of you being with us out of Washington, D.C., former U.S. diplomat to Saudi Arabia, Mr. Michael Springman, and out of San Francisco, investigative journalist, Mr. Lee Kaplan. As always, viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another debate. I'm Marzia Hashemi, signing out. See you next time.